Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
I mean, how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, great, Barry, a reefer.
Hi, and welcome back to the Koala podcast. And we're back on sort of home turf, back in Western Australia. And we're talking to Paul Mavor of the Legalise Cannabis Party Australia. He's standing for the West Australian. I always forget whether it's the Senate or the Upper House. I lose track of what everybody likes to call themselves. As we know, Dr. Brian Walker has been pretty active in as the first sort of cannabis MP in Western Australia. And I noticed his messaging has really upped over the last sort of 6 or 8 weeks. I've spoken to a couple of other people who are standing both federally and in state houses. So I just thought I'd try and cover as many people as possible for this election and give them a bit of time to talk about themselves and why they're doing what they're doing. Because I imagine on Channel 10, 7, 9 and the ABC, they get about 30 seconds, or as Dr. Walker discovered, 0 seconds, as the ABC didn't think that he was worthwhile having on their radio debate about Western Australia's upcoming state election. Sorry, Paul, for the long intro. Welcome to the show, and thank you for taking time to talk to us.
You and hello.
Maybe we start with a little bit of your background with regard to cannabis and why you're standing.
Well, to a large part, I was very inspired by the aforementioned Dr. Brian Walker. He thought about being in politics, so I'm really good at my job in dispensing cannabis. But he is very, very inspiring. He, due to what a lot of he's done himself out there, and he's an amazing educator. So I felt compelled to stand up for what's right and spread the message about medicinal cannabis and advocate for patients and a number of other things, both in the medical cannabis space and the hemp space. I think they're both very important.
So, I mean, you're a dispensing pharmacist of cannabis in Western Australia, yes?
Yes, I am. I'm Perth, West Australian bred and based, and I currently run 2 medical cannabis dispensaries. I've previously been involved in both education of medicinal cannabis, mainly to health professionals, and also to the wholesaling of cannabis. My dubious claim to fame is I imported the very first ever medical cannabis through a company I set up called Health House, and we imported the very first ever shipment of Canadian medical cannabis into Australia. It started a whole new boom of like international trade involving medicinal cannabis. It's one of the very first exports of Canada on a global scale, and they've really dominated in that space up until now.
You're obviously standing on, various sort of party sort of ideas and arguments. I mean, personally, what is it that you, if you got in, you'd hope to achieve in the next sitting for, let's start with medical patients in Western Australia?
Well, just to clarify, I'm standing for a seat against the sitting premier who won, his party won last time by a landslide. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form thinking that I'll have another job.
That you're going to be sitting.
Jobs.
Yeah.
However, I'm just so happy to be able to create a little bit of noise for patients and health professionals alike. But the number one issue facing patients and their prescribers is cannabis and driving, where there's laws currently that aren't fit for purpose, where the mere presence of THC, even though THC can be in your system because it's fat soluble for up to 2 months, it doesn't mean you're impaired at all. And chronically ill patients are being warned against driving and directed by their health professionals and sometimes law enforcement and sometimes their employer to not take these medications, which help considerably, in my opinion, chronic long-term pain.
What are you finding in Western Australia at the moment in terms of police enforcement, obviously they've got to apply the law. Are they being overzealous about cannabis?
No, it's my experience, unless the individual is really mouthy, that the test they currently use is very unlikely they'll pick up cannabis. But most patients want to do the right thing. They're not impaired. And let me state very clearly that no one should ever drive impaired, whether it be alcohol or benzos, or indeed, in this case, cannabis. Absolutely no, they should do everything they can to make sure that, they're not impaired and they do the right thing. But the roadside saliva tests, I'm told, are very inaccurate. They only pick up saliva in the mouth if you haven't rinsed out your mouth or brushed your teeth, and you've consumed cannabis within a very short period of time, like 5 to 15 minutes. So they're not really fit for purpose
No,
anyway.
look, I've been speaking to NIST in the US. I had a couple of conversations with them. I noticed actually they're about to hold a big conference because they're trying to work a way around this to actually get the science to create tests that don't rely on saliva tests. They say they're a long way away, though, and it's going to be a long time before any sort of realistic tests can work out the difference between what's in your system and impairment with regard to cannabis.
Absolutely. I think Canada's probably got the best laws that currently, from what I've seen, that they do a roadside sobriety test, which law enforcement officers have been doing for years, are very capable of doing. We stand on a line and put your finger on your nose, and if they suspect someone's impaired, they might do a blood test. And that blood test will capture very accurately any levels of THC or any other drugs in their system. So that seems a very fair and equitable way of doing it.
With regard to medical cannabis in Western Australia, but Australia generally, what are your thoughts? I mean, you said you're the first importer of medical cannabis from Canada. I see quite a top-heavy import market and a bit of a disaster in developing a proper agricultural medical cannabis market in Australia. I think disaster would be an understatement. It virtually doesn't exist. And it seems to be a long-term Australian problem, just across the economy. Is if it's easier to import something, you can make a lot of money very quickly. I'm not saying you as in, but generally. And my view is Australia is very good at agriculture, and it hasn't got the nuts and bolts in the legislation, and the regulators don't understand that you could actually turn this round and create something that's very positive for Australia. I mean, as a person who's basically in the import market at the moment, would you like to be supplying to your patients grown in Australia, processed in Australia, made in Australia, and then exported by Australia?
Absolutely. I'm a patriot through and through. However, I'm currently not an importer. I'm very retail patient facing. So whether I was an importer or patient facing, I'd want the best deal for the patients. And market forces really dictate what happens. And when Australia first legalized for medicinal cannabis, there was very few patients, very few prescribers, numbers were very little, and there was a few companies who invested hundreds of millions of dollars, and they built these amazing big facilities, but there was very little in the way of turnover. I know one particular company who did very well. They started with a sea container, and that company's still around now, but there's a few that didn't. They started with a big bloated facility that bled money left, right, and centre. So it made sense from an early stage to import it from other countries like Canada, who've been doing this since the year 2000, that had ready-made product that could just send a little bit of extra product to Australia. But what I'm seeing more and more, there's a few emerging Australian companies, and there's a couple in particular who are now exporting overseas. We're not there yet, but we're certainly heading in the right direction.
Is there more
That being
investment
said,
going into
there's
that
imports
side?
coming from a number of different countries.
Is there more investment? Do you see, or I don't hear because I'm not
Absolutely,
physically in
yeah.
the
And
country, but
there's
is that coming
consolidation.
back now?
there's consolidation. It's market forces, and companies are picking up the pieces of other people's work. And these are companies that have got their own patients. They're loyal to their brand, and they're starting to do well. But we're starting to see some companies do very well in the export market. But there's a few new countries coming online, like Colombia, Thailand, South Africa, that are doing very well on their own right. But I think Australia, by far, like are really good at agriculture, but we're not quite there yet.
And in terms of Senator Shoebridge's recent legislation introduced into the upper house before Christmas, talking about adult use environment. I mean, we know the party's views. What are your views on how you manage medical and recreational, as people like to call it in Australia? Because it seems to me, my job is to be slightly critical, is that there is some leakage of the recreational market into the medicinal market in parts of Australia, where, personally, I know of people who can say they've got a bad back or there's some sort of issue, but actually, in the end, it's fuzzy anyway between medicinal and recreational. The actual products that are available at this stage of the proceedings, 20 years time could be a different thing with when the big pharmaceuticals have got involved more. How are you feeling about how those things work together? Should they be separate? Should there be an omnibus sort of bill federally for Australia? I know that's dream and fantasy world. You've been now working for 10 years in this space, dealing with, I presume, in the main, proper medicinal patients who need medicine in order to stay well. But at the same time, the growth in the Australian market and the gung-ho-ness of the international market about how much they can sell in Australia implies to me that some of this medicinal market, just based on our population, isn't completely medical.
Well, there's a lot of questions there, but let me.
I know. Sorry, we're having I am more of a conversational guy, so
that's right. That's a good thing. My views very much reflect the parties, but I see it as a foregone conclusion. Absolutely, within our lifetime, there will be adult use. Cannabis, should I say? I was going to say medicinal cannabis in Australia, and we've had a bit of a taste of that in ACT. And a report recently by
I was going
Ian
to be speaking to
McGregor
that guy
at
earlier in the week about his report, actually, because I wanted to catch up.
He knows his stuff. He's very well spoken. I met him at one of my very first ever medicinal cannabis conferences I went to in Vancouver, Canada, and his study and spotlight on the ACT realised, as we all suspected, the sky did not fall in. People did not use more cannabis. Those people were growing cannabis at home, at least those who put in their samples, grew it pretty well with the absence of pesticides, which is the number one thing. But I'd be a hypocrite to say that, there's medical and adult use. I'm sipping my medical grade craft beer I use for relaxation. It helps me fall asleep in front of the TV, but pretty much most of my patients use it for, I believe, for a medical form, whether that's being, relaxation, anti-anxiety, or insomnia. And we do see a lot of patients with more serious medical conditions. I'm talking about cancer and the likes of MS and Parkinson's. They get great benefit out of it. But from where I'm sitting, whilst there might be the occasional, patient who brags about this, most are using it in some medical way, but it won't happen overnight. It will take a bit of time. The authorities need to be comfortable with it. They're coming more comfortable with it because they've seen the medical system, in my opinion, mostly work very well with a few hiccups. And I think we're definitely on the pathway. And it's important to note drugs like Nurofen, when they were first released in Australia, were prescription only, and over time they were down scheduled. I believe the same will happen with cannabis, and we will be able to
Do you
buy
think
it
it's a
without a
5 year
prescription.
process or a 10-year process?
I would have thought 5 to 8 years. I think the legalized cannabis party are doing a fantastic job, and they've got the right people advocating for them and speaking with authority that there is little in the way of harm, lots of potential economic benefits associated with both the hemp and cannabis industry. And I think um, in the near future they're going to hold the balance of power, and essentially they're a one issue party. There's one thing they want. And after hearing a number of times, especially from Brian Walker, who's a prescriber himself, he's very well spoken and an authority on medicinal cannabis. I think all the facts and the science and the economics point to an adult use market in Australia. And there's been other jurisdictions like Canada who first legalized for medical early 2000s, and then 2018 they legalized for adult use. And pretty much every state of America where they've got an adult use policy, they legalize first for medical and then later on for adult use. And Germany as well, South Africa. There's a whole wave of countries around the world. Thailand did it a bit differently, but they think just legalized everything in
Oh,
one hit. And
they were very Thai about it. They,
yeah,
drive the truck really, really
yeah,
fast when it's about to crash. Oh, shit, we better slow it down.
they did.
Having lived
Yeah,
in Thailand a bit, their approach
yeah,
didn't surprise me in the slightest. So it's
yeah,
whereas Australia likes to
yeah,
start driving the truck slowly and then maybe let it pick up speed
yeah.
halfway across the Nullarbor, maybe.
So we're getting there in Australia. We started at a very high level with specialist prescribing only, but they quickly learned that and I heard this afterwards from the regulator in New South Wales, that they were really worried about diversion and people giving it to children. And they saw a lot of great benefit from some of their patients. And one thing they really noticed and took note of is patients came back for their second and third prescription with they wouldn't have done it if it hadn't worked for their chronic illness. They would have tried it once, like glucosamine, which I'm not a big fan of,
Mhm.
so for the record, and then tried something else. For medicinal cannabis, we see a lot of patients. They come in every month for their prescription and get great benefit out of it.
In terms of, you mentioned hemp, and we hadn't got round to that discussion. Again, there's a great opportunity in Australia for massive industrial hemp industry if it wants to put the investment into it. West Australia is actually quite good with hemp compared to the rest of the country, isn't it?
We're getting there. I'm just fascinated by the hemp industry, and a big advocate for hemp. And I see in a lot of ways it's got the potential to be bigger, or just as big as the medical industry. There's a lot of it's an agricultural product, but they do need some offtake agreements and some people to
And do you think
drive it, I
Australia can
suppose, in that.
avoid the problems that they've developed for themselves in the US with all these HHCs and that market getting out of hand, hemp for human consumption, they like to call it. It's but the problem is the cat is out of the bag. The science is there, so it's not going to not happen. But I presume anybody who's smart in the industry in Australia realizes that somehow has to be managed, so you can really stop all the silly chatter about that becoming a Murdoch media issue stroke problem, and you can actually get on with growing hemp for what you want to use it for, which is just about everything else, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. No, it's got great potential, and Australia was first founded as a colony for hemp, and Joseph Banks gave the first settlers hemp plants to plant, and they sailed to Australia with hemp riggings, hemp sails. They wore hemp clothes and wrote on hemp paper. So it'd be nice to see a bit of resurgence of that, particularly in building materials. And my lovely wife, Charlene, and I recently completed a house built out of hemp, built by well-known West Australian hemp builder Gary Rogers. he entered in one award and ended up winning six by the Master Builders Association in the Southwest, and they were amazed and said they said this is the future of building. So it's got a lot of potential, and we just can't build energy hungry double brick houses anymore. That this has a lot of potentials as far as insulation, being fireproof, fire rated. You can literally hold a blowtorch to it. It's got great thermal and acoustic properties. And I love the fact that the hemp for our house was grown about 20 kilometers of the way. And if you applied the same to a double brick house, you'd be trucking clay to the kilns, and then you'd be trucking bricks wrapped in strapping on pallets, hundreds of kilometers, with loads of wastage. And with regards to a hemp house, there's a very little in the way of wastage. We use something like 2 skip in full, whereas a normal house uses about 10. And our 2 skip in fills, half of it was full of packaging from some of the furniture.
So, I mean, out of interest, that builder, how's he processing his hemp in Western Australia at the moment?
He built his own processing factory in Margaret River, and yeah, he's still working with hemp building, and he's doing quite well. But got a lot of potential, I'd say, if anyone, if there's any builders interested in something innovative, then definitely look at hemp.
That's the issue I'm getting to is hemp processing is really where the investment is needed, isn't it? Throughout the whole
Absolutely.
country
Yeah.
and there's plenty of people who are digging stuff out of the ground further north in the state who have a lot of money. Are they putting their money into these sorts of solutions?
Not yet. It's a case of horse and cart and chicken and egg sort of thing that you probably need someone innovative to show people what can be done, and you need to start off small and grow exponentially, much like the medical cannabis industry. But there's a lot of potential as far as pet bedding and insulation and various like garments and other skincare products.
Now, you said you're standing against the Premier, so you're not going to have, you never know your luck in the big city, as they say, but it seems to
I
me
might do a Bradbury, but I'm not going to lay awake at night thinking about it.
worrying
I'm
about it.
first and foremost hoping create awareness, and raise the issues. And it'd be nice if there was a substantial amount of, patients or cannabis enthusiasts or hemp enthusiasts within his electorate to at least make him take note that
Well, that's what I
he
was
can't
driving
ignore
to,
that.
because Dr. Walker seems to have just had a one-sided battle where he says things, and the government literally doesn't want to listen to a word he has said over the last 3 years. How do you feel that the state Labor government in Western Australia are taking in anything that's appearing in front of them? I mean, have they moved on from when they came into power? So if they get re-elected, will they actually pay attention in the next parliamentary sitting?
The West Australian government are currently looking at driving laws involving THC, which is a lot, in his first term, and I think the best is yet to come. I think, as I said, there's a really good medical and economic argument for achieving some of the party goals.
Well, Paul, Mavor, thank you very much for appearing on the Koala podcast and giving us a little bit of insight into some of the things happening in Western Australia. I mean, look, I think Western Australia is way ahead of the rest of the country. I mean, Queensland's pretty good, but the existing politics manages to shove them to the side very well. But because of Dr. Walker, and because there has been, a hemp industry building in Western Australia and medicinal cannabis, I do think that part of the country is going to lead the rest of the country if, as we just discussed, the Labor government wants to listen to what people are saying in your party, but just other voices as well, because it's not just the Cannabis Party really talking about these issues, is it? It's a wider part of the community now.
Absolutely. That I like to make friends, not enemies, and there's a very compelling reason to do a lot of what we're trying to do. And I think ultimately the patients, the general public would benefit. Um, the argument against is becoming really, really old and thin, and
Increasingly
you
unrealistic,
know,
I think is probably the best way.
absolutely, absolutely. I'm very hopeful. It's, as I said, it's a foregone conclusion.
Well, again, thank you very much for being on the Karma Koala podcast. And I wish you the best of luck and hopefully